This is the second to last buy low video we are going to have this season. Trade deadlines are coming quickly. Before we get into the guys that we are targeting this week, let's recap what we talked about last week. One, Chris Olave. Well, I'm sorry, I did not realize the man was sadly going to see his fifth concussion of his career. Now Olave realistically is most likely going to be missing week 10, week 11, by week 12. At the very earliest, I think you get him back week 13. Can I tell you to go buy him low now? Probably not. I'm sorry for the call last week. Nico Collins, we had as that buy low candidate, essentially just cementing now that you have no Stephon Diggs. Going into the future, Nico Collins, the expectation is he's a top 5 wide receiver from a points per game perspective. And arguably, I'd put him at 3, only behind Jefferson and Chase. We had the wide receivers that started off slow from changing offenses with both Amari Cooper and DeAndre Hopkins. Obviously, Amari Cooper missed the week with a wrist injury. I still have full faith that Amari will be the wide receiver 1 for Josh Allen going into the future when fully healthy. We'll talk about him in this video. And DeAndre Hopkins was a very clear buy low candidate after doing nothing with his first week with the Chiefs, just expecting the overall snaps to increase, understanding that Mahomes was going to be able to provide more passing volume in this offense going into the future. I'm recording this at the halftime of the Monday night game where DeAndre Hopkins is already blown up, so the buy low window on Hopkins is probably shut if you didn't get him last week. We talked about Deebo Samuel. We'll talk about him in a second. And we talked about Evan Ingram with the expanded target share that you should have with no Christian Kirk in this offense. And Evan Ingram actually sees 10 targets in week 9. And I believe Evan Ingram is a borderline top 5 tight end going into the future. And the buy low window still may be open because obviously the fantasy points weren't anything crazy this week. Now I'm going to be very brief with our first buy low candidates this week with Deebo Samuel, because obviously we talked about Deebo last week. I still want to reiterate that I believe that Deebo Samuel has the potential to be a top 10 wide receiver rest of season from this point onwards, understanding that you are looking at an offense that consistently projects to be at the top of the NFL every single week with their implied team total. Now, yes, you have McCaffrey coming back in, but at the same time, no Brandon Ayuk rest of season. The base expectations that we'll have with Deebo here is that you get the expanded target share, and all of a sudden we go back to the ceiling that we have seen from Deebo in the past. Because I understand maybe this season he's been a little bit disappointing, where so far you only have one game with 20 or more fantasy points. I mean, you're looking at, besides the game in week 7 where he gets injured, a game with only 3 fantasy points against Arizona. So technically only one game with under 10 points this year when he's been healthy, but only one game with 20 or more. But we understand that Deebo Samuel is a player that has dealt with injuries pretty much through his entire NFL career. I mean, this was something that followed him from college. I mean, you go back and you look at what you had with Deebo Samuel his rookie season. You only get 15 games played. His second year, you get 7, then 16, then 13, then 15. And now obviously he's already missed a couple of weeks here with miscellaneous injuries, but now you get the extra week removed from both the pneumonia as well as the wrist. And I think this was the perfect bye week timing that you had for Deebo Samuel. And now going up against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, base expectation is it's a very bad Bucs secondary, where obviously we'll see what the Chiefs do in the second half of this game. But going into this week, the Bucs had allowed 9 total passing touchdowns over the past 2 weeks. So I honestly think Deebo will immediately be a top 12 wide receiver in my rankings starting this week. And if we go through and look at the trade finder on the site to figure out some realistic trades that have happened today with Deebo Samuel, you had Ramondre Stevenson and Tank Dell get traded for Deebo and Jordan Addison. I have Ramondre Stevenson in the Flock League. I view him as a low-end RB2. I'd love to sell him for this price point to get Deebo. We see Tyrone Tracy and Romeo Doubs get dealt for Deebo Samuel as well. Again, I view Deebo Samuel as that low-end wide receiver 1, high-end wide receiver 2. Tyrone Tracy in a significantly worse offense will be capped to a running back 2 in my mind based off the limited touchdown upside. We also see Devonta Smith get traded for both Bucky Irving as well as Deebo. Now, honestly, I would probably prefer Deebo straight up over Smith, depending on the extent of the A.J. Brown injury. And then we also see CeeDee Lamb get dealt for both Deebo Samuel and James Cook. To be honest with you, typically I am not wanting to do these 1 for 2 tier downs, but specifically in that league where we see it happen, you actually have the ability to start 4 wide receivers weekly. So you have multiple flex spots. And at the same time, if you look at the Dak Prescott injury combined with the Deebo Samuel shoulder, I don't necessarily think that Deebo is significantly behind CeeDee Lamb in rest of season ranks at this point. If you look at my rest of season rankings currently on the site, I have Deebo Samuel at wide receiver 13, directly ahead of guys like Devontae Adams, Bryant Thomas Jr., DK Metcalf, and Mike Evans. Now, of course, we will talk about another one of these wide receivers shortly. And of course, if y'all wanted to also check out that trade finder, it's completely free over there on flockfantasy.com. This is the same website where you can actually link your fantasy football team. And if you play on Sleeper, ESPN, Yahoo, see the updated power standings in your league based off rest of season projections, see the best waiver wire pickups in your league as well. But we also have that trade finder over there where if you ever wanted to make a trade for or trade away a player, you can actually put that player into it, put in your exact league settings, and see all the real fantasy football trades that have been made with that exact player today, yesterday, the day before, throughout all of history. I will leave the link down in the comment section as well as the description if anybody is interested. It's completely free. I'm going over to our next player. We're going to be looking at Brian Thomas. Thomas is my wide receiver 15 rest of season. I'm directly ahead of DK Metcalf, Mike Evans, Jaden Reed, Devonta Smith. This is not the first time that we have had Thomas on a buy low video. We had him on the buy low after the Chicago performance in London, where you only see 5.7 fantasy points. And yeah, we'll throw him on the buy low again when you only see 6.2 against the Eagles. I mean, here, very disappointing game in general, right? If you look at the underlying volume numbers, you only see 4 total targets, which is tying his career low. You had 4 targets in week 1, 4 targets in week 2, 4 targets in week 8, and now the 4 targets in week 9. You only have 2 receptions, which ties the career low back in week 2, and you only have 22 receiving yards, which sets a new career low for Brian Thomas Jr. So this has been the worst performance that we have seen from him all season. Now, with that being said, for me, I think it's actually encouraging to know what we can expect going into the future. I know that sounds weird, but if you look at the underlying snap rate, Brian Thomas Jr. plays 91% of the snaps here in Jacksonville. Previous to this, his career high was 79% going up against the Chicago Bears back in week 6. So we actually see that, yes, confirmation with the Christian Kirk injury, with Gabe Davis banged up as well, that Brian Thomas Jr. is going to be an every down player and running a route on effectively every single Trevor Lawrence dropback. He had already been one of the most efficient wide receivers in the NFL so far this season through the first half of his rookie season campaign. And what we typically see with these rookie wide receivers is you see the efficiency come at the beginning of the season. When they prove themselves with the efficiency, you all of a sudden see the volume really follow strongly, typically in year 2. But here with the Christian Kirk injury, I think that's going to be the catalyst to really prop up Brian Thomas Jr. to instead actually have that breakout this season. If you're looking at some of the trades that were made in the trade finder, I see Ramondre Stevenson get dealt for Brian Thomas. I would trade Ramondre for him in a heartbeat. We see DK Metcalf, Romeo Doubs get traded for Thomas and Kareem Hunt. To be honest with you, I have DK Metcalf also in the Flock League. I just traded for him from Sal, and I would probably make that pivot to Thomas if possible. We also see DeAndre Hopkins and Kareem Hunt get traded for Brian Thomas. And obviously, Hopkins in the first half of this Chiefs game is going nuclear. He was on the buy low video last week, but I think I honestly have a lot more faith with the rookie superstar wide receiver based on what we've seen so far this season. Now, going over to Amari, with Amari, it's very simple. We don't have to talk about it a lot, but I mean, just going through and projecting this out into the future. Now you have the Keon Coleman injury. Amari is labeled day-to-day at the very start of this week here in Buffalo. My baseline expectation is Amari comes in and he doesn't necessarily see the same type of target share that he had in Cleveland. We talked about this when he was in Cleveland. And remember, I actually had this guy in the Flock League, traded him away immediately in week 1 when we got a sense of how bad Deshaun Watson was. Felt like we wanted nothing to do with him. But now when you're with Josh Allen, while the market share numbers may come down, the efficiency can dramatically come up. We haven't seen anything in Buffalo because the first weekend, he only plays 35% of the snaps. Now with those 35%, he does score 16.5 fantasy points. The second week, you only play 50% of the snaps. He misses the third week in Buffalo due to the injury, but really hoping that you get him in to a full extent in week 10. Looking at him in my rest of season ranks, I have him right in the same range as guys like George Pickens, Zay Flowers, Chris Olave, DJ Moore. I know people are going to think I'm an insane person. In full transparency, I'm an idiot. But looking at like Flowers versus Amari going into the future, I actually think that the passing volume in their respective offenses may be comparable. I think that Baltimore is going to lean a little bit more on the run, especially when they get to the goal line with Henry. And if you're looking at what you're going to get with the Keon injury versus Deontay emerging there in Baltimore, I think that Amari and Zay Flowers are very similar rest of season. Obviously, would I recommend to go trade Flowers straight up for Amari? Probably not. Probably want to try to get him at a better discount if you are buying low. Such as some of these trades we can see in the trade finder over on the site. Somebody traded Leggett Jamison for Amari Cooper. No brainer. Somebody traded Chubb for Amari. No brainer. Somebody traded Keenan for him. No brainer. Somebody traded Laporta and Hopkins for Amari and Pitts, which is a very interesting thing to look at, obviously, with how Hopkins performs in the second half. I'm not going to fully commit to saying that we want to make that deal right this second. We'll see what happens in the second half of this Chiefs game. But going over to our next player, we are going to be looking at Isaiah Pacheco. Now, this is the first week that we have included Isaiah Pacheco on a buy low video. Y'all can go back to what we did with Christian McCaffrey. The first week that we included McCaffrey on a buy low video was back about when you actually had him 2 to 3 weeks from returning. Because when you're 2 to 3 weeks from returning, the comment section is full of people saying he's never going to be back. The comment section is full of people that are never even thinking about him. And once you wait the week before the return, it's too late. Like, don't try going and trading for McCaffrey now. The time to trade for McCaffrey was 2-3 weeks ago. And I think you're going to see the same thing here with Pacheco. Now, full transparency, very similar to what we said with McCaffrey, it's not a guarantee that Pacheco's back in 2 to 3 weeks. There is that outside chance that Pacheco's not back until the real life playoffs, that Pacheco's not back until week 17, week 18 to ramp up for the playoffs, because obviously the Chiefs are a team that really truly only have Super Bowl aspirations. They don't care what's going to happen in the regular season. Just revisiting what Pacheco was able to do in the first 2 starts here for KC. You get 18 opportunities in week 1 involving some usage as a receiver. You get 24 opportunities in week 2. We've obviously seen them consistently force feed Kareem Hunt, even with the inefficient rushing attack. So I think when you get Pacheco back in and the efficiency can come back, I'd be a little bit more excited about it. And then going over to what we have with the trade finder, we have Darnell Mooney, Chuba Hubbard getting traded for Pacheco. I think you can roll the dice there if you don't need Mooney. We have Waddle getting traded for JSN and Pacheco. There, I'd rather have JSN straight up over Waddle rest of season, so you're getting Pacheco just as a freebie. Somebody traded Cedric Tillman for Isaiah Pacheco. And if you think about it, if Pacheco is 2 to 3 weeks out from returning, which isn't a guarantee by any means, realistically, Pacheco's already through the bye week. Tillman has the bye week in week 10. So Pacheco comes back, say, in week 12 or week 13. What, you get an extra 2 games from Cedric Tillman? I don't really think that does much, to be honest with you. Now, going over to our next buy low candidate, we probably should have just led off with him. We've had a long history with Malik Nabers. Now, I have flip-flopped with Nabers so many different times. Now, to be honest, I feel like I've maybe been a little more consistent than everybody else. Our take with Nabers is simple. He is one of the most talented wide receivers in the NFL today. Not in the future, right now, right this second. But the reason I didn't love drafting him in round 2 of Underdog drafts, the reason why we said to sell high on him after week 3 when he was the number 1 wide receiver in fantasy is because the offense isn't good. Touchdown upside is going to be limited in a bad offense. We know this. Yes, maybe in the first month of the season, he comes out, he scores 3 touchdowns, and everybody thinks, oh, he's different. He could be in one of the worst offenses in the league, and he can score touchdowns at a high clip. No, that's not going to be the case. Realistically, with Nabers, what he is going to be is he's going to be an absolute target hog that's going to potentially lead the NFL in targets per game, which is incredibly valuable in a full PPR format, but he is going to maybe be a little bit more volatile and a little less consistent with the touchdowns, which is why we've said it since the beginning of the season when we put him on the sell high video. You can't have him in the same tier as Jefferson. You can't have him in the same tier as Chase. I think Nico Collins is in that tier now as well, because those other wide receivers, they're in good offenses. There is touchdown upside with the quarterbacks that they play with. Nabers, you're going to have a touchdown rate that's lower than league average, but if he is leading the NFL in targets per game and the receptions per game can be right up there as well. And obviously, you have the big play potential because he's one of the most talented receivers in the league. He is still a mid-wide receiver 1. So I've seen a lot of people actually now straying away from that and getting very worried in the live streams. But for the love of God, if you have Nabers, don't panic. The last thing you ever do is sell this dude. I have him wide receiver 7 in my rest of season rankings. I think he's a very safe mid-wide receiver 1. I have him right ahead of guys like Kupp, Puka, Lamb, Wilson. I would honestly trade Lamb for Nabers, knowing that Lamb's about to be in a pretty bad offense as well with no Dak Prescott. And at the same time, Lamb's dealing with a shoulder injury himself, whereas Nabers is fully healthy. Now, going over and looking at some of the trades that have been made with Malik Nabers. Now, realistically, if I had Lamb, this is actually what I'd look at. Somebody traded Lamb for Nabers and DeAndre Swift. I mean, if you can pick up an extra running back, it's a no-brainer. Somebody traded Chase Brown, who does appear, I want to be on record, Chase Brown appears to be a low-end RB1 until Zach Moss comes back, and we don't even know if Moss will be back this season. And Bucky Irving for Malik Nabers. I mean, excluding Purdy and Geno here, because I'd rather have Purdy over Geno anyway, but give me Nabers in that deal. Somebody traded Devonta Smith and Cortland Sutton for Malik Nabers. No-brainer. Somebody traded Higgins and Pacheco for Nabers. I know we just talked about buying low on Pacheco, but realistically speaking, Nabers is in a completely different tier. If we were to redraft today, I think Malik Nabers goes in the early second round. And if he was going in the late second round as if he was on Underdog this offseason, I honestly would have drafted as much of him as I could have if I knew not only is he going to be one of the best wide receivers in the league a couple of years from now, but no, instead, he is one of the best wide receivers in the NFL today. But I think that's all I got for you. Again, if y'all wanted to check out that free trade finder, we also have a free trade calculator over there on the site where you can put in your exact league settings just to make sure you're not getting robbed in any of the deals that you make. You can find that for completely free over there on flogfantasy.com. I'll leave the link in the description in the comment section just in case you wanted to check it out. What I would highly recommend if I were you, just because it is completely free, if you're playing on Sleeper, if you're playing on ESPN, if you're playing on Yahoo, go to the My Teams page, link your team. That way you're able to see updated power standings based off rest of season values. Plus, you're able to get a great idea of who the actual best players available on your waiver wire are, because I know those platforms, they really sort it in a weird way based off weekly projections that may not be relevant to who you're actually looking to pick up. But I think that's all I got for you. I really appreciate you and really hope we get to see you out with the live stream later tonight.